Welcome to the Scholar Chronicles. I'm Dr. Low KS, a historian. In this podcast, I ask other scholars to share their stories from the field. These stories are rarely discussed, but I think they are interesting because they shed light on the research we do, challenges we face, and the relationship between scholarship and society. And in this regard, our hope is for the podcast to help us do our research a little bit better. Today, very happy to have with us a good friend and fellow scholar, a fellow historian, Darinee. Morning, Darinee. How are you?
Good morning, Kasing. I'm good, thank you.
Could you say something about the work that you do and what kind of field you are in?
Sure. So I'm a lecturer at the South Asian Studies program at NUS, and in this role, I convene modules relating to South Asian history and culture, with a focus particularly on Tamil studies. I convene the Tamil studies modules, but I also teach a range of courses on such aspects of society as Bollywood cinema, food cultures in South Asia, and of course, an introductory course to what South Asia is all about.
And we'll come back to that teaching a bit later on. And just by way of introduction, right? How long have you been in academia?
Right. So I have been in academia now formally for about 5 years, but I've been preoccupied with my research for much longer than that, of course. I'm a historian by training. I did my MPhil and PhD in history, MPhil in Modern South Asian Studies, PhD in history from Cambridge University. And I've always been interested in this sort of nexus between state and society and how that equation changes with the collapse of empire, colonialism, and with the rise of new nation states. So this is broadly my research area that I've been looking at.
Mm. So from the time of the MPhil to now, how many years would that be?
That's about 12 years.
12 years. Okay.
Yeah.
So this podcast really, came about when we were having dinner the other day, and we were just having so much fun, right? Talking about how you came into academia and what happened along the way. A lot of our conversation has really been about this topic, right? How to get forward in academia and to do with writing and publishing and balancing that with teaching and stuff like that.
Mm.
So really, I think the podcast for the audience would be one that would be of interest to younger scholars. Younger scholars meaning PhD students or students who want to do a PhD. Not very sure what academia is and what they can expect, right? Because I think, and this is true for you and true for me as well. And that's why I'm so keen to do the podcast with you is these experiences are not unique. They're not because of the individual. They are not necessarily because of where you are based, which university you are based in, but this is a kind of very universal experience for all academics, and it's really at the heart of what academia is. So what we want to do today is to kind of uh, take away the veil of academia so that we can see it for what it really is and what it expects from us, right? I think a lot of students go into academia because they like to do research. I hear this all the time from my own students. Is that enough, for them to sustain a career in academia? And so that really requires some hard thinking and good advice actually from mentors and people who are already there to tell us about what academia expects from the researchers, especially for young academics. And we don't often get enough advice from the seniors. Yeah. So hopefully this podcast goes some way to do that. All right. So I'm going to run through a number of topics that are germane to this discussion, and then and we're going to hear from Darinee's experience to use that as a foil to reflect on what young scholars can do. So I know that previously you were a teacher in a school, and then at some point you wanted to leave the teaching service and get into academia, go to graduate school. Tell us about that decision to make that change.
So the decision, to make my profession one in education was one that was made fairly early in my life. I signed on for an MOE teaching scholarship, and as a result of that, right after graduating with my undergraduate degree in history, I was posted to a junior college, pre-university type setup here, right? And having completed my bond with the government, I had the opportunity to seriously reflect on what it is about education that appealed to me. And while I've always been a firm believer in education and in the potential of education to change lives, to transform lives, the experience of having taught in a junior college also got me thinking about how teaching without the research element is half the story, is half the experience. And so I found myself yearning for that, and I found myself yearning for a research driven approach to education, which is when I decided that it was perhaps the research calling that I missed and that would enrich my teaching practice. And when that realization dawned, I applied for my postgraduate studies at Cambridge for a scholarship and took off to explore that path.
What was that research that you missed?
What was the research that I
Mm-hmm.
missed?
Yeah, you said
So,
you yearn for it, right?
yes. So the research that I undertook at my MPhil or for my MPhil degree looked at transnational reform movements
Sorry,
linking.
I mean the research.
Yeah,
You said you missed the research, so you're
sure.
referring to something earlier, isn't it?
But it wasn't a particular topic as such.
No, I mean like, are
Yeah.
you talking about your university, your undergraduate research? Because
Yes. Well,
yeah,
in a sense,
yeah.
What I mean more by research, I think, yeah, this is terminology that has been influenced by our journey since then, right? But for the undergraduate degree, of course, I did a dissertation, and so there was a research element there. But what I meant for this yearning for research was more an inquiry-based approach to the questions that we take up by way of framing our teaching focus. And so when I started thinking along those lines, I realized that I want to know more about the themes, the topics that are of interest to me. And one of those topics was transnationalism, which I explored in my postgraduate studies. But more broadly, it was about getting into the archives. It was about um, finding out for myself what the past holds before I can enthuse my students in the subject, rather than being recipients of secondary passed on knowledge. To be able to interpret that data for myself was important to me by way of scaffolding my students' understanding of the discipline.
I kind of understand what you mean, but at that point as a teacher, you know, really immersed in teaching in classes on a daily basis, meetings and paperwork and all that. How did you know that there is this thing called research and inquiry based, and how did you know that, and how did you decide that you actually leave the teaching service, a big decision, to embark on this new career?
It was a big decision. Like they say, teaching is an iron bowl, right? And here we are leaving that for the uncertainties of what happens um, post PhD. In fact, at that point in time, I wasn't looking to do a PhD,
Mm.
but what I knew I wanted was to get away for a while, to really immerse myself in questions that were of interest to me. And I think much of this boils down to personalities. And in my case, it was precisely the nature of the work, the paperwork and the meetings and all of that, that got me thinking that um, perhaps I need more in life, to enthuse me and to sustain my enthusiasm for education. And when I made that decision and when I got the scholarship to do my MPhil, that made the decision a whole lot easier because I wasn't forking out money to experience this journey that I wanted to experience. So it was relatively low commitment for me. So I went on to do that. And when I did, I realized that I had been onto the right idea. I thoroughly enjoyed the experience, particularly in terms of researching and writing my dissertation. And that was what made me decide to stay on for the PhD. I decided I wanted more of this and I would take the risks and uncertainties that would come with it because, the thrill of the journey was just too great to pass up.
So this was during the MPhil, at some point during the MPhil, right?
Yes,
Because
that's
that's
right.
the system that Cambridge uses. What happened during the MPhil?
So it was during the MPhil, and the MPhil at Cambridge, it was an MPhil in Modern South Asian Studies. There was a coursework component, but there was also a dissertation component to it. The coursework was, how coursework usually is, one gets through it. But I loved the open-ended nature of the dissertation component. The fact that, you're free to choose any topic under the sky. You're free to choose your approach. You set the parameters really, and you decide on the schedule for that as well. That open-endedness was something that really appealed to me. Um, because I think I thrive best in situations where um, I'm given a blank canvas and I'm free to explore ideas, which is what I did. And the experience was fulfilling. The feedback from my supervisors and examiners was that it was a great piece of work. In fact, I received the Best Dissertation Award that particular year, which was, in a sense, validation for me that, others were also interested in the kind of ideas that I had. And that made me want to explore these ideas in greater depth.
So this was a module dissertation, or was the MPhil dissertation?
This was the MPhil dissertation.
MPhil dissertation, okay.
Yeah.
Which is like kind of like a master's dissertation, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Okay, so blank canvas, positive feedback, affirmation. Do you still think that is true today? That this is how academia works? It's a blank canvas for you to do open inquiry and you get positive feedback.
Well, the picture has shifted somewhat since
Yeah, yeah.
those wonderful days of being a carefree graduate student. But I think certain elements remain true.
Mm.
And again, I think it boils down to personalities. What I would say from my experience so far is that it's certainly not a blank canvas.
Mm.
One is always in conversation with other scholars in the field, or one needs to be in conversation with other scholars in the field if one wants to be a successful academic. Having said that, though, I think it is important to remain true to one's interests as well. And I think there is scope to do both. I think that the field can be defined, the field can be interpreted in ways that reflect the scholar's own interests and creativity. And I think it is important too to be able to do that, to pinpoint an area of interest that is relevant to other scholars in the field, but which still speaks to one's own, search for truth in a sense, right? Or search for meaning in a sense.
To put it very simply, right? In the beginning, for me, and it's still true today, if there was a topic that was not original, like someone else had done it already,
Mm.
I wouldn't want to do it. That was the way that I thought about academia in the beginning, you know? And then uh, you realize that it's not really the case because there are rarely number one, they are rarely original topics, right? And number two, which is more critical, I think, is it's got to be a topic that other scholars are interested in. Yeah, if you do a topic that is completely original, completely out of the blue, then is very much at the periphery of people's academic vision, right? And they don't want to hear about it. They don't really want to see it because it's not useful for them. They don't know the literature around it. The phrase, right, to stand on the shoulders of giants is sometimes applied to academia, and I always think that's it's a load of rubbish, actually, right? It's patting on the back of academics before you, to think that they're actually giants. The people that we refer to, we cite, we talk about, we discuss their work, we draw upon their work. Are they really giants? You know, and that is at the heart of academia, right? That um, there's this circle in which your work is located, and you can't do your research exactly without them, right? Without acknowledging them and without acknowledging their importance. Is that something that you experience?
In a sense, yes. So I think there are two aspects to this. For instance, the topic that I'm working on now, the topic of my first book, is alcohol and its prohibition or attempted prohibition in India. And this is a topic that has not been explored by scholars. They have not deemed it important, perhaps, or interesting enough. It behooves me why this topic has not deserved the interest that it deserves. But it remains a topic that is really on the peripheries of scholarly interest. But the issue here is that while the topic itself has not been studied, the themes that undergird it are very much relevant to scholars. So one can be in conversation with scholars in the field, whilst at the same time identifying a topic that has perhaps not deserved the kind of attention that it deserves and merits. But the challenge then to young scholars would be to be able to identify these broader themes and issues that are of relevant to a wider community of scholars, to be able to tease out and explain their significance and to employ this research in the field that is already established. And that can take many years because, often, especially when we strike out and we are new to academia, there is a tendency to miss the forest for the trees, to be so fixated on details that we don't see the big picture. But once we do, and once we establish that there is a field out there that this topic relates to, then that could be a potentially, interesting take, a fresh take on a theme that has already been established. And about positive feedback, coming back to the earlier question, as professionals in academia, I think one has to be prepared for the fact that one needs to work many years in succession without any feedback, right? Or that the feedback that one gets is not necessarily positive. It can be quite critical, especially when we send out work for peer reviews, whether this be work in the form of journal articles or book chapters. There's often a great deal of criticism to take on board. Sometimes there are outright rejections. But I think there is a need then to go back and to really rethink and assess one's approach to things, to see if it is really a matter of a topic just not working out, or one's approach not working out, or perhaps it being a case of needing to tweak certain aspects of it. But I think young scholars need to be prepared for the fact that it is not all going to be hunky-dory. You're not going to get an A or an A plus to sort of guide you along. And one has to, in a sense, hold on to one's vision of things as well, in the face of rejections.
Darini, you're speaking like a British. One has to hold on. Too many years
It's,
at
it's
Cambridge.
I know it's the way I speak now. Unfortunately, I've
Yeah,
been.
yeah. There's a
Uh,
the Cambridge, the Oxbridge legacy. Anyway, I want to come back to that hunky dory because I'm not sure that there isn't a way to be hunky dory about academia. But the thing about the feedback, right? I mean, the feedback that we get from peer review does give you an idea about how keen the field is, your network is in academia, is about your research. What kind of feedback have you gotten from the reviewers? And not just the book, but also the articles you published.
yes, so the feedback has changed and
Mm.
evolved with time, which shows one's, which I believe shows my,
Yeah,
evolution as well as a scholar. So early on, when I would
yeah.
send articles for peer review, the main point of feedback that I would get is, all of this is empirically very rich. It's all interesting, fascinating, but what is the bigger story? What is the bigger issue here? Right? How does this connect what is already out there? And this is what I meant earlier when I said that there's a tendency to miss the forest for the trees. I realized that I was so fixated on the details and explaining the story as it was, being the true, empirical sort of historian that I am, that I was, in a sense, not engaging in a critical enough conversation with scholars in the field. But with the book, the feedback has been that it connects in very direct and intriguing ways to the literature that is already there. And the feedback has been then um, more along the lines of thematic concerns, which shows that, now I'm able to articulate the significance, um, and that therefore there has been growth in that regard as a scholar. So I think, for young scholars, the kind of feedback that one gets is also reflective of where they stand in their journey, how far they've come along, and what the main issues for improvement, what the main aspects of improvement are for them.
Mm. Are your reviewers from South Asian Studies?
Yes, they are.
Mm. Mm. From the people that probably from the people that you cite or that circle, right?
Yes, broadly, yes.
Mm-mm. Okay, so that's good to hear. Um, I mean, I'll just tell you one thing about my book, right? The book that was from my PhD. Uh, I used to keep a list of citations, right? The people who cite my book, and I think less than 10% are from Singapore historians. My book is a book on Singapore history, and less than
Excuse me.
10% are from Singapore historians. So that is a failing, right? A direct failing if the book was intended to speak to other Singapore
Mm,
historians.
mm, mm,
So that's one thing. The second thing is I think in my literature, literature did not really reach out to Singapore historians. My literature reached out to uh, people in fire studies, disaster studies, urban studies. So most of the citations I got were from Singapore social sciences.
mhm,
Yeah, and some of it was actually from urban studies, from disaster studies, and all that. And often they are a lot more appreciative of the work compared to Singapore historians, right? So if I were to do it again,
mm,
how would I do it? You know, and was that the best way to do it as far as one's career is concerned? And I want to get back to the point that you made earlier about persuading scholars
mm.
about your research and why they should read about it, right? And
Sure.
that really, I think, gets to the heart of it because it's no longer an academic question, right? It
Mm,
is not about how good your research is and how good your arguments are,
mm,
but it's psychology and pragmatics, right?
mm,
Psychology because the life of academics extremely filled up,
mm.
things to do, teach, research, meetings, paperwork,
Sure.
and all that. Do you want to read about something that is not like in your the center of your
Mm,
vision, but at the
mm.
periphery, right?
Right.
Um, how do you can't persuade them academically, right? Because they are more
Mm,
comfortable with doing something that they are familiar with. They want to read more about things they already know,
mm.
new research in their field from younger scholars. That's like a psychological issue and not an academic issue. It's about
Sure.
habits, right?
Mm,
It's also about what is practical for them. So, so as authors, we come from a standpoint that people should read our work,
mm.
right? But what is the interest of the audience that we are writing to?
No,
Mm,
absolutely. I think that's a fundamental question
mm,
for any research, that it has to speak to more than just the scholar or the scholar's immediate circle of friends or colleagues. So for me, when I was envisioning this book and what it would be, what it should be, there was a lot of conflicting advice,
yeah.
by way of pre-feedback from well-wishers and advisors who wanted to see this book in print. So, for instance, there were some who believed that a comparative history between American prohibition and Indian prohibition would be the way to go, and that would also be, the most commercially viable, profitable way forward. And then there was a group that believed that this was a history about labor. It was a labor history book. And then there were others who wanted to see gender as the main focus of the book. Um, and this was, as enriching as the feedback was in pointing out that there are endless opportunities out there, possibilities out there, it was also very confusing for me as a young scholar, because for a long time, several years, I found myself in the wilderness trying to address all of these claims and all of these, pieces of advice, with the effect that the book was not doing any of it. It
Uh,
was sort of here and there and everywhere, and it didn't have a central focus. So this is where I think, once again, um, the scholar's voice, the author's voice, has to be made predominant. Like, while you consider all of the feedback and advice, I think it's also important for one to reflect on what the research has led them to conclude. And when I did that, when I sat down and forced myself to think about the topic itself, the data that I had, and the conclusions that I had drawn, I realized that while all of these themes are, in a sense, there in the book, that this was a book really about policy and how policies are made and unmade over time. And when I pinpointed that idea, then the book essentially took shape. And so it addresses these scholars. But the challenge to me then has been to invite readers into the book and to show them how it addresses them, whilst at the same time keeping my focus on what it is that I want to say through the book. And I think the series editors, I had submitted it to a series.
mm,
They sent it out to South Asians because, that would be South Asianists, because that would be the main focus for the series itself. But I believe that has been written in a manner that would be engaging to
mm,
a broad spectrum of scholars working in such fields as colonialism, nationalism, alcohol studies, labor, gender, because various chapters take up these areas of focus. So that was one way that I struck this balance for myself. I had thematic areas of focus interwoven through the book, with that intersect in important ways with the main argument or the themes that I present.
to get conflicting advice, confusing advice is, very much part of the academic experience, right? Especially
Yes.
when you're a young scholar. Uh, well wishers always say this or that. They probably didn't try to confuse you, but they might not know the work well. It might be their
Mm,
own work, it might be their own interests. And as a young scholar, you definitely need that self-awareness and self-confidence to stand up for your work. I want to ask you, I want to go back to the point about the hunky dory, right? So you've taken an approach of, doing this manuscript PhD on alcohol and policy of prohibition, uh, kind of more or less targeted at South Asian scholars. Would it not have been better if you had started from the beginning with a certain field in mind that already has an audience? You know, that okay, these are the group of scholars that have written about this topic, and I'm going to make an intervention in this topic that is substantial, not completely original, of course, but substantial enough and interesting enough for them to already you'll be guaranteed of a readership right there. Would that not have the start? So the way you started, right? Would that not have been a better way?
I think in hindsight, it would have been more prudent to go about it that way. But I think for me, the challenge in doing that would have been to sustain interest. Because, I think I could have done that easily. And there were topics in mind that presented at the time when I was choosing a PhD topic, including, for instance, developing and building what I had worked on for my MPhil. And my supervisor was very much in favor of that approach as well, which would have found a ready audience. And, had I taken that road or route, I would have had my book out by now. But I think knowing me as a scholar, I may not have been willing to continue with that journey had I done that. Because how I realized this over the course of time, and I'm not speaking for everyone when I say this, is that I need to be working on something new that challenges me and that presents me with an issue that I had never really thought about before, in order to sustain my interest in that topic. And it's a balance, right? It's always a balance. For instance, what I mean by that is, um, you know, it's a question of whether one wants to be over and done with something quickly and as efficiently as possible, or whether one, believes that the journey is what makes the final product or destination even possible to begin with. So in my case, had I done something that was more obvious, I may not have sustained the interest to remain in academia for long, is what I'm saying. So, while this has been a longer journey, it has been immensely fulfilling. It has been challenging, but in the process of being challenging, it has forced me to think about issues that I would not have otherwise thought about. And for me, at least, I think that is what's enriching about research. I mean, it may not be the most prudent way to go about it, and I may not do this for my second book project. But where I am, I would not have changed how I went about it.
Right. So for the second book project, how would you approach it?
I think now might be the time to return to an early interest, the MPhil topic and transnationalism, and to work on that, because it's been a long enough time that I've not really sat down and thought about that topic, which means that for me, at least, I'm able to look at it with a fresh pair of eyes, with a fresh perspective. And I think this is how I operate, at least. I need to take a break. I need to revisit things after a while, and that keeps my interest alive.
Is there an established group of scholars working on that topic? I suppose there is, right?
Yes, there is.
Okay, so you're good to go then.
I hope so. I hope so.
Right. So I guess the point here is there needs to be a balance, right, between personal interest and what the academy wants from us.
Yes, absolutely. So I
Right.
think one needs to ask themselves what it is that really interests them or that motivates them about research. And having pinpointed that, then the trajectory becomes less daunting.